In the remote hills of Tennessee, where roads turned to dirt and hollows swallowed the sound of passing wagons, there was a family that spoke less with words and more with silence. Outsiders called them private. Neighbors called them strange. But those who lived closest to the ridge whispered something darker, that their marriages were not marriages at all, but arrangements no preacher would bless, no courthouse would record. It was in this silence that a woman became a bride, not to a stranger, not even to a cousin, but to her own nephew. The wedding left no trace in ledgers, no lines in the Bible, no stone to mark its place in history. Yet the memory survived in hushed voices, told by old-timers who remembered seeing lanterns burning late on the night of the secret vows. They said the woman was pale, her face drawn, her hands trembling as she stood beside the boy who was barely a man. Their eyes were downcast, never meeting, as though even they knew what had been done could not be spoken of outside that hollow. No preacher stood before them, only a father who mumbled a blessing under his breath. No hymns were sung, only the creak of the cabin walls as the family watched in silence. For generations this hollow had hidden its secrets behind shuttered windows and nailed boards. But this union, between aunt and nephew, was the most disturbing of them all. And though the ceremony was meant to be forgotten, the land itself seemed to remember. To this day, locals say the trees on that ridge grow twisted, leaning inward as if bent by the weight of the secret they were forced to keep. What began that night was more than a marriage. It was the start of a curse that would haunt every child born of that union, a curse of silence, shame, and shadows that stretched far beyond the hollow. The story of the marriage between a woman and her nephew might have died with the hollow, if not for the fragments left behind. Courthouse ledgers, tattered family Bibles, and the memories of neighbors all hint at the same forbidden truth. A wedding that should never have happened, yet did. By the late 1800s, the county courthouse in rural Tennessee kept its records in heavy-bound books, each page carefully filled with births, deaths, and marriages. But when clerks searched for proof of this union, nothing could be found. A gap, a silence, a page where an entry should have been but wasn't. Some say it was never recorded at all. Others whisper that the entry existed, only to be torn out, years later by someone desperate to keep the family's shame from view. Yet the absence of records raised more questions than answers. Census takers who climbed the narrow paths into the valley noticed something strange. Children bearing the same last name as both their mother and father. Their ages overlapped in ways that made no sense. A child listed as a daughter one year would appear as a wife in the next decade's roll. Neighbors, when pressed, admitted to confusion. It was like the family folded in on itself, one said. You couldn't tell who belonged to who. In the hollow itself, the marriage ceremony was treated not as sin, but as survival. Outsiders were never welcome. The family believed that to bring in strangers was to invite ruin, to risk their land being stolen, their traditions mocked. In their eyes, keeping marriage within the bloodline was not an abomination. It was a duty. A woman marrying her nephew was just one step further into the circle that had already closed too tightly. Old-timers recalled the night of the secret vows with unease. There was no preacher, no church bell ringing out across the valley. Instead, the family gathered in their cabin, a single lantern casting long shadows against rough-hewn walls. The woman, pale and hollow-eyed, stood beside her nephew while her father, a man who should have been her guide, not her officiant, spoke words no law would recognize. Some claimed there was singing, low and droning, almost a chant. Others swore it was nothing but silence, punctuated by the sound of wood creaking under shifting feet. In that hollow, silence was its own language. It told neighbors all they needed to know. Children began to appear soon after, their resemblance to both mother and father too striking to ignore. Whispers turned into warnings. Mothers told their sons, "Don't wander too close to that ridge. Don't speak to their daughters." But the warnings came too late. The family was already locked in a cycle that could not be undone. By the 1920s, census records listed entire households under a single surname, with lines between siblings and parents blurred into nothingness. Teachers who tried to enroll the children noticed they were slow to speak, often avoiding eye contact, their expressions eerily blank. Some seemed to lack the ability to read altogether despite their age. And though the teachers tried to report what they saw, their concerns were dismissed. "It's mountain ways," they were told. "Let them be." The silence of officials, neighbors, and even the land itself allowed the truth to remain hidden. But hidden does not mean forgotten. To this day, descendants of that hollow carry features that locals claim betray their lineage. Eyes too wide, faces too similar, voices that rarely rise above a whisper. The marriage between a woman and her nephew was not an accident, not a one-time mistake. It was the product of a system that placed secrecy above law, blood above morality, and family above everything else. It was a ceremony performed not in defiance, but in obedience to a rule too twisted for outsiders to comprehend. Keep it in the blood, no matter the cost. If the marriage itself was the secret, the children were the evidence. Their very existence spoke what no record dared write. They were born in silence, raised in shadows, and carried the unmistakable stamp of bloodlines that had turned inward. Too many times, neighbors who passed by the hollow spoke of children who looked not just related, but nearly identical. Faces blurred into sameness. Round cheeks, narrow eyes, and jaws that seemed slightly out of place, as though sculpted by an unsteady hand. Their hair was often thin, their skin pale, as if the sun itself refused to touch them. And yet, despite their sameness, each carried their own mark of suffering. Some were slow to walk. Others never spoke. A few lived only a handful of years before their small graves joined the hillside cemetery. A teacher who tried to enroll one of the daughters remembered her vividly. A girl of 10, with eyes too wide for her face, who never answered a single question. She sat motionless, staring straight ahead as though waiting for something or someone that never came. The teacher wrote a single note in her ledger. Expressionless, empty, as if she is not fully here. The note was crossed out by her supervisor, and the girl never returned to school. Inside the cabin, the children were raised under rules outsiders would never understand. A mother who was also an aunt, a father who was also a cousin. Relationships folded back on themselves until words like brother, daughter, uncle, husband became meaningless. To the children, the family tree was not a tree at all, but a circle, a closed loop with no way out. Stories circulated of infants born with twisted spines or with eyes clouded over before they had even seen their first dawn. One boy was said to crawl on all fours until he was nearly grown, his legs unable to carry him. Another girl, neighbors claimed, repeated the same two words again and again. Mama, sister, Mama, sister. To those outside the hollow, it was a haunting reminder of what the family bonds had become. By the 1930s, whispers reached county officials. But when doctors and clerks visited, they often returned with vague reports. One physician recorded developmental delays, possibly hereditary. Another simply wrote, "The blood is too close." Yet none of these findings made it into public record. Files disappeared, reports were burned in courthouse fires, and the officials who dared speak too plainly soon found themselves reassigned to other counties. For the neighbors, it became a pattern too dark to ignore. Each year, more graves appeared. In the woods behind the cabin, small shallow mounds marked only with rotting wooden crosses. Hunters who stumbled on the cemetery swore the skulls were not quite right. Eye sockets too large, jawbones too thin, spines bent like broken branches. No one lingered there long, and yet, amid the suffering, the cycle did not break. Daughters grew, and when they reached a certain age, they were bound into the same silence their mother endured. Outsiders asked why no girl ever fled the hollow, why no boy ever broke free. But the truth was simple and terrible. When family becomes both prison and law, escape is not freedom, it is betrayal. And betrayal in that family was unthinkable. The children became both victims and enforcers of the curse. Some grew to adulthood, their bodies frail, their minds clouded, yet still they repeated the same ritual. A son became a father, a daughter became a wife, and the line bent further inward. What should have withered under the weight of its own, deformity instead endured, passing silently into the next generation. Locals said the land itself seemed to reflect the family's decay. The cabin sagged lower each year, the fields lay half-tilled, the animals scrawny and sickly. At night, lantern light glowed weakly behind shuttered windows, casting distorted shadows that made it impossible to tell how many lived inside, or who was who. Some swore they heard children's voices crying, not in play, but in pain. Others said they saw pale faces peering from cracks in the wood, disappearing when approached. By mid-century, the children of the Union had become the living proof of a story that officials tried desperately to erase. They were the echoes of a ceremony that never should have been spoken, let alone lived. And with every new birth, the secret grew louder, until silence could no longer hide it. By the late 1940s, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Teachers, doctors, and neighbors, though fearful, had each left scraps of testimony. Together, they painted a picture of something grotesque unfolding in the hills of Tennessee. County officials finally sent word to Nashville, requesting an investigation into what they carefully called unnatural unions. But the family on the ridge had already heard the rumors. News traveled fast in small towns, and their paranoia was sharpened by decades of secrecy. They believed the outside world wasn't simply curious, it was hunting them. To them, county officers weren't coming with laws, they were coming with torches. The patriarch, aging but still feared, gathered the household one night in the one-room cabin. Survivors later recalled his voice trembling but fierce. He warned them, "The world will not take us alive. If they come, they will not break what God has bound." His words were not a threat, but a prophecy, and then, as if to prove him right, the fire came. On a bitter December night, a hunter spotted flames climbing the ridge. By dawn, word spread that the family homestead had burned. Neighbors rushed to the scene, but what they found left more questions than answers. The cabin was reduced to ash and charred beams. Yet inside the smoldering remains, there were no bodies, no bones, not even the smallest trace of those who should have perished in the blaze. Instead, there were signs of something more deliberate. Beds had been stripped bare. Pantry shelves, usually full for the winter, stood empty. The cemetery behind the house bore fresh disturbances. Graves dug up, caskets removed. It was as if the family had vanished overnight, leaving the fire as a smokescreen for their exodus. Locals whispered that the blaze had been lit from within, that the patriarch himself had struck the match to cover their escape. Some claimed they saw shadowed figures moving deeper into the hills as the flames spread, carrying bundles too small to be food or clothes. Others said they heard children crying in the woods long after the house was gone. County officials arrived days later, but by then there was nothing to investigate. The family was gone, the land scorched, the paper trail thin. Reports written by investigators were vague, filled with words like possible abandonment and voluntary relocation. But the people of the Hollow knew better. The family had not fled from something. They had fled into something. Deeper into the mountains, deeper into themselves. For years after, hunters and travelers claimed to see lights flickering far beyond where any house should be. Sometimes, strange sounds carried across the valleys at night, hymns twisted into chants, children's voices repeating words no outsider could understand. The family was gone, but not gone far. They were simply waiting, buried deeper than before. And the fire, meant to erase their trail, only ensured their legend would burn brighter than ever. For nearly 20 years after the fire, silence clung to the ridge. The charred clearing grew over with weeds and young saplings, and newcomers to the county hardly believed there had ever been a house there at all. Locals knew better. They avoided the hollow, telling children to never stray near it after dark. And yet stories still surfaced. Hunters spoke of stumbling upon crude shacks miles deeper in the forest, built from rough-cut logs with no chimneys, as if the smoke of a fire might betray their presence. Travelers claimed to see pale figures at dusk, barefoot and silent, slipping between trees like ghosts. But when sheriff's deputies followed the rumors, the woods swallowed their search. It was as if the family had become shadows of the mountain itself. The mystery might have ended there, fading into folklore, if not for what happened in 1974. A team of surveyors mapping the hills for a new highway project uncovered something chilling. A row of unmarked graves, shallow and crudely dug, hidden beneath tangled brush. The bones were small, too small, and when state officials examined them, they noted signs of malnutrition, deformity, and in some cases, deliberate injury. The discovery revived old whispers. The state quietly halted the project, citing environmental concerns, but locals knew the truth. The graves matched the time when the family had supposedly vanished. And yet, these weren't the graves of an escaped group fleeing into the wilderness. They were the remains of children, perhaps the ones carried into the woods on that December night. By the 1990s, genealogists had begun digging into rural Tennessee records, tracing tangled family lines that never seemed to leave the same ridge. What they found was damning. Marriage certificates from the late 1800s and early 1900s revealed generations of unions between uncles and nieces, cousins, even siblings. The last legal record of the family name dated to the early 1950s, when two teenagers applied for a marriage license under suspiciously vague circumstances. After that, the trail goes cold. But DNA doesn't lie. In 2011, a genetic study conducted by researchers at Vanderbilt quietly flagged several participants from eastern Tennessee. Their markers revealed extreme genetic similarity, the kind seen only in tightly isolated communities. When asked about their heritage, participants grew evasive, offering half-truths and denials. Yet behind closed doors, one admitted something that confirmed the darkest suspicions. My grandmother used to whisper, the descendant told researchers, that she was both daughter and niece. She said our blood carried God's curse. That confession cracked open a door long sealed shut. Soon more fragments emerged, letters hidden in attics, photographs of weddings no church would sanction, and in one case a diary describing the night of the fire. The diary's author, believed to be a girl no older than 12, wrote of her uncle standing in the doorway with a kerosene lamp. He said the outside was coming. He said the fire would hide us. He told us to walk deeper and never look back. Even today, hikers in the Smoky Mountain backcountry report encounters too strange to dismiss. Families living in collapsing shacks, speaking in archaic dialect, refusing all contact with the outside world. Children with pale eyes that seem too large for their faces, and when offered help, these families vanish before authorities can intervene, disappearing into the timber as if they were never there. The truth is that Tennessee's forbidden family tragedy didn't end with fire or graves. It metastasized, slipping deeper into the hills, carried forward by descendants who refused to acknowledge the world beyond their bloodline. The patriarch is long dead, but his commandment survives. Stay hidden, stay pure, stay together. And so, the ridge still whispers. Some secrets burn, others bury themselves in the earth. But this one walks, generation after generation, unwilling to die, unwilling to be forgotten.